Welcome to Methods Talk, the Methods at Manchester podcast. I'm Professor Emma Bannister, the Director of Methods at Manchester. In this episode, we meet Dr Chloe Steadman, who is a Senior Lecturer in Marketing at Manchester Metropolitan University. Chloe is based in the Institute of Place Management and has research interests focused on consumer culture, the body, time, place and atmospheres. Her studies incorporate a range of qualitative approaches, including ethnography, interviews, creative and multisensory methods. Chloe joined us to record this episode following her Methods at Manchester masterclass focused on researcher vulnerability. I started by asking her how she first became interested in researcher vulnerability.
First off, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me onto my first ever podcast episode, actually. I'd like to note to the viewers, I currently have 4 cameras and 3 microphones pointed at me, so I'm currently feeling a little vulnerable myself, which is perfect for today's conversation with you, Emma. Yeah, so my first sort of experiences of researcher vulnerability, I think, were during my PhD research. Before then, I'd sort of done undergraduate projects, I'd done a master's research project, but I guess my PhD was the first time where I'd done quite an in-depth research project. So I first became very aware of my own vulnerabilities during a particular fieldwork trip to a museum exhibition. And this exhibition was in Bristol, and the title was all related to sort of human perceptions of death. And there was a dimly lit reflections room at the end of this exhibition that I found myself in at the end of my fieldwork trip. And in this reflections room, visitors were encouraged to reflect on time's passage, on human mortality, and the various people they may have lost in their lives along the way. So as I sat in this reflections room myself during this fieldwork trip, I began to reflect very heavily on the people I'd lost in my own life along the way, such as my mum when I was 11 years old, followed by my grandparents with whom I was very close, and of course my beloved pet cat, who I won't give you the name of because I named her when I was very little and it's quite embarrassing. But
oh, go on.
I'll maybe come back to that a little bit later on. But as I was sitting in this reflections room, obviously I felt quite anxious at times, I felt quite uneasy, and I felt quite upset during this fieldwork visit as well. So I think that's the sort of a point that really stands out to me, is when I first became very aware of my own research vulnerabilities. And from that point, I started to seek out sort of literature and journal articles to, I guess, feel a little bit less alone with my own research vulnerabilities, to see if anybody else has experienced the same sort of thing. And luckily, I did come across some really useful articles by people in the marketing field, such as Kathy Hamilton, Hilary Downey, but also beyond marketing to sociology, people like Andrew Sparks, Arthur Bachner. They write quite a lot about this topic of vulnerability, about these sort of blurred lines between personal and academic selves, and also around sort of autoethnographic techniques. I think that's when I first started focusing on more heavily during my PhD studies, definitely.
And so that's really, really interesting. What did you do with that? So you sort of recognise that there was such a thing as researcher vulnerability and that you were experiencing that. Where did you take that?
During my PhD, I kept an ongoing research diary. So in this diary space, I reflected both on my own personal tattooing experience. As you said, my PhD research was looking at the links between body and time. And I was doing that through the lens of tattooing practices. I was also looking a bit about memorialization, memorial tattoos, the tattoos people have to remember loved ones that they've lost in their lives. And I very much kept a diary about both my own personal tattooing experiences, because I do have a couple of tattoos myself, including a memorial tattoo to remember my mum and grandparents and pet cats, who I won't give the name of just yet. But I also used that diary space during my studies to reflect on the personal challenges I had encountered along the way. And recently that's been actually turned into a published journal article in the Journal of Marketing Management, which is going to be part of a special issue that's coming out soon on the topic of celebrating failure. So I guess that's where I took it eventually.
That's interesting. You just touched on that there, this idea. I mean, we'll come to the article in more detail in a second, but that idea of failure, I sort of wonder kind of how it sort of links with failure and how you would frame it.
I think in academia, vulnerability is often framed as this more negative thing, as something that needs to be mitigated, managed, avoided, both in terms of when we're tasked with protecting the anticipated vulnerabilities of our research participants when it comes to filling out ethics forms and thinking about the ethics of our research. But also I think we're often encouraged to see vulnerability as almost being this sort of failure. So you're not competent enough, you're not successful enough, you're not productive enough. And I think it is sort of framed in this certain way, perhaps in wider society more generally as well. But I think that particularly comes through in academia. We're often encouraged to produce these very neat and tidy accounts of the academic research process, both in our academic writing in terms of PhD theses, but also published academic articles. We don't necessarily have the word count available to present the more messy sides or vulnerable sides of our research, and nor would all reviewers necessarily see that in a positive way. So I think that it often is framed as a bit of a failure within academia, not just the research side, but I guess there's vulnerabilities around perceived teaching failures as well. Not that I see it as a failure, but I think in the academic culture more widely, some might see it as being a failure and that you're not competent or professional enough, perhaps, if you were to be very open about your vulnerabilities.
That's so interesting. I mean, talking about, you sort of mentioned there the idea of the sort of complexity and the messiness in terms of writing up research. I mean, obviously you came to this understanding during your PhD study itself. Did you find scope to incorporate that into your PhD write-up, and how did you do that?
Yes, I think myself and my own experiences featured quite heavily in my PhD thesis. Actually, I didn't realise myself at the time that I had been quite so reflective, but I think if you remember, you were in my PhD viva, and one of my PhD examiners did sort of make the comment that it was a particularly reflexive piece of work, which I guess I didn't recognise myself at the time, but I can recognise now reflecting back. So, for example, right at the beginning of my thesis, I sort of touched on my personal experiences with my body and sort of body image issues as to why I was so interested in the body and why that was a key focus of my thesis. I also analysed my personal tattooing experiences alongside my participants as data in my findings chapter. So I talked a bit in my findings chapter about my acquisition of a memorial tattoo and sort of some of the fears I had around, will the tattoo be painful? Will I regret its permanence? And so on. So I also featured in my findings chapter. And I also had a standalone sort of short reflective piece at the end of my thesis where I reflected explicitly on some of the vulnerabilities and messiness and sort of serendipity that came through my research design and sort of what I've learned from that process and sort of how that manifested for me. So I think it did become quite a reflexive piece of work, which was, it did elicit my vulnerabilities in itself, because I did become a bit concerned about sort of how other academics, if they ever came across my thesis, I know probably just yourself, the examiners, and perhaps one family member will ever read that piece of work, but I was worried at some points whether somebody might come across my thesis and wonder why I was so featured in there and whether they would judge me negatively, which elicited vulnerabilities in itself, I think.
So I suppose that's also the sort of challenge of, you mentioned autoethnography, kind of combining that with more mainstream ethnographic methods as well, and how those kind of interlink. I wonder if you wanted to say anything about how you managed that, I guess, in the writing.
Yes, so I had quite an ethnographic research design in my thesis, and I sort of use more ethnographic techniques anyway, but I don't personally feel like there's a divide between my personal self and my academic self. So I think naturally there's often an autoethnographic aspect of what I'm doing, because I always sort of reflecting on sort of how myself might be shaping my analysis of my participants' experiences, how I might be perceiving certain fieldwork sites. So whenever I write ethnographic field notes, I'm not just observing participants or the site itself or perhaps the sensory features of that site, but also my own sort of personal experiences and emotions also feature in these ethnographic field notes. So I think I do see the two techniques as quite blurred in my own practice anyway. It might not be this case for everybody.
That's fascinating. I mean, moving on to the research paper and the decision, I guess, to sort of put yourself out there, because you've hinted at that already, kind of this sort of idea that I think you're doing yourself an injustice, but the idea that not many people might read your PhD thesis, but actually sort of choosing to publish a paper that is very specifically focused on your vulnerabilities as a researcher. I wondered how you felt about writing that paper. What emotions were there, even making the decision to write it in the first place?
Yeah, so I came across the special issue, which is the Journal of Marketing Management special issue. It's not out yet, but I believe it's coming out shortly. And the theme of that special issue is celebrating failure. So I guess that really resonated with me. I sort of read what the special issue sort of called, the call for papers, and it sort of really resonated with my experiences. So I guess I did feel comforted in the fact that somebody had even decided to put that special issue together, that other people might also be going through the same things. And if I were to submit this paper to the special issue, there would be other papers featured that may be doing the same sort of thing as me. So because of the special issue theme itself, that did sort of quell my anxieties a little bit. Although, of course, that decision to sort of write it up, I think I sent a draft for you as a sort of a friendly review, even sort of making that decision to show it to you before I'd submitted it, and really sort of choosing to hit that journal submission button on the system. I think that's when it sort of really dawned on me that actually somebody is actually going to review this and read it at this point. And if it eventually, fingers crossed, did get published, if I sort of had nice, favourable reviewers, although they were constructive, that other people might then read it. So I think the most anxious I felt was when I actually pressed that journal submit button, and that period then when you're waiting for a couple of months to see what the reviewers would think of it, whether they would just reject it, whether the reviewer comments would be really negative or judgmental. I can note they were very constructive and positive reviewers, which I was very lucky with, but I think it was quite anxiety-provoking, that thought of the review process. I think it's always quite vulnerable sending your academic writing off to any journal, no matter what topic you're writing on. But I think it becomes even more heightened when you are writing about your own experiences, when it's a more autoethnographic piece and when it's a more vulnerable piece of academic writing in itself. I think that does heighten those worries and anxieties that it might just be rejected. You might get these negative reviewer comments, and if it eventually got published, that people might come across it and think, you know, you're not professional, you're not competent, or you can't cope with things. So it was anxiety provoking, but the review process was really friendly. It was really supportive and constructive. So it was a really nice experience in the end, actually.
I mean, that's quite interesting, actually, because it's almost that sense that you're writing something very personal, where you're sort of bearing your soul, and then the review process is anonymous. So you haven't, I suppose, that feeling of loss of control, which actually can heighten people's vulnerabilities in itself. That's really interesting. You mentioned earlier on this sort of idea of the kind of messiness of research, and then we kind of package it up in a very sort of neat and tidy way, for publications. I mean, is there anything more you'd like to say about that? I mean, does that need to change, or is it more about sort of identifying discrete ways in which we can engage with that messiness?
I think there's probably room for both, so these more traditional articles, but I think there are outlets coming out now that are more receptive to more creative pieces or more non-representational work. I know my friend Jack Coffin and Tim Hill, they've recently put together a special issue of the Journal of Marketing Management all about presenting marketing differently, where they were allowed to sort of publish more creative pieces. There was sort of I think artistic pieces, even apps. So I think there are these outlets that are more receptive to these pieces that do showcase the messiness of research or the more non-representational aspects of research. I know marketing theory, there's pieces in there around sort of poetry. I think Journal of Marketing Management showcases more creative outputs as well. The Journal of Customer Behaviour, the newly revamped journal there, again, they're very good at sort of enabling these more, I guess, non-traditional academic outlets to emerge. So I think things are changing a little bit, and perhaps we need to think about other ways in which we can showcase the more behind-the-scenes nature of research, which isn't always possible within the journal word counts and sort of these traditional academic writing conventions we see at most journals, I think.
Okay. And sort of thinking about vulnerability itself, I mean, obviously there's sort of literature out there on vulnerability in different kinds of contexts. In terms of your sort of work specifically looking at research of vulnerability, what sort of have you added, or do you feel you can sort of contribute to our understanding of vulnerability?
Yes, as you say, there's not loads and loads, it's not hundreds of articles out there about this topic, but there are more people coming through now that have written around this area, which is great to see. I love reading these other accounts and sort of seeing the similarities between my experiences of vulnerability and others. I really appreciate the fact anybody that's published in this area.
So I know you talked earlier about understandings of vulnerability and sort of developments in academic literature. I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about, where you feel that you've sort of added to our understanding and kind of contributions in that area.
Yeah, so as you say, there isn't sort of loads out there published on the topic of research of vulnerability, but luckily, as I began reading more and became more interested in this topic, I did see a lot more articles starting to come out now, which is really nice to see. It sort of gave me more confidence to publish in this area myself. So what I was trying to think of when I was writing this paper was, what actually am I adding new to, I guess, the conceptualization of the concepts of research of vulnerability? I think what I do in the paper is sort of show it's a more extended concept than has traditionally been conceived of in existing studies in this area. So a lot of the research on research of vulnerability sort of focuses on the present day fieldwork period and how that can elicit people's vulnerabilities. So when doing fieldwork or interacting with interview participants and so on. But what I found from my own experiences, and that I report in this particular paper, is that my own research of vulnerabilities were also shaped by memories of the past. So it could have been memories, some unexpectedly coming to the surface from my own life histories. Sometimes it was memories of difficult moments in my participants' lives that I had to keep reliving as I kept going back to my interview transcriptions, listening back to interviews and so on. I also found my research of vulnerabilities were elicited by my anticipations of what might happen in the future. So sometimes, for example, I hadn't even been to a fieldwork site yet, but in advance of going, I felt quite anxious. I felt like I wouldn't belong, particularly places like tattoo conventions. I'm not visibly or heavily tattooed myself, so I just anticipated, I'm going to feel awkward there. I'm not going to know what to do with myself. I won't feel like I belong. So I guess that's one of the main things I contributed, was that it's not just based on the present day, but it's based on past memories and anticipations of what might happen in the future as well. I think another thing I sort of showed in the paper and through my experiences was that I'm not fixed as an always vulnerable researcher. I'm not always sort of having these heightened vulnerabilities, but it can actually is quite fluid, and the intensity of my research of vulnerabilities actually oscillate and fluctuate over time and space as well. So it's not this static thing that I'm always feeling at a very heightened level. It sort of ebbs and flows over time and depending on which fieldwork site I'm in as well. So I think they're the two main takeaway messages in the paper. Number one, it's a more extended thing impacted by memories and anticipations. And number two, that it's a fluid thing that fluctuates over time and space, I think.
That's really interesting. I think that sort of idea of anticipated vulnerabilities is interesting as well. I mean, I suppose you could look at that in two ways, as sort of being prepared, but also is that the danger that we'll always be anticipating something? I think, can that be quite unnerving, I guess?
Well, that's maybe where the fluid things comes out, right. Realising that you're not going to be fixed. There's always being anxious about the future, but it will ebb and flow. For example, there were some fieldwork sites I visited, such as museum exhibitions. I went to an exhibition at Somerset House. It was an art exhibition all about tattooing and time. So I thought, perfect. When I saw it advertised, that's directly related to my topic. I didn't feel anxious at all at that exhibition because I'm not quite used, but I guess I was more used to being in those sorts of exhibition spaces. I was a bit more anonymously passing through. Whereas in somewhere like a tattoo convention where I didn't have much experience in the past with, I sort of had more heightened vulnerabilities about how I would perhaps felt like I was going to feel in those sites. So I think it's not always this heightened worries about anticipations, but it can ebb and flow, and the intensities of vulnerability can shift over time as well.
And I guess that's sort of having that understanding, being in touch with your humanness, perhaps it sort of allows us always to be prepared, maybe. Is there something within that as well?
I think it's important for researchers to always sort of have reflexivity. I think it comes back to that point that there aren't these neat divides between our personal lives and academic lives that can all very much blur together. We often choose topics that resonate with us in some way. Perhaps it's something in our life histories or something we're particularly interested in. So I think that not seeing those barriers is something that's really important, and always sort of being reflexive. And I think things like keeping a research diary can be really helpful for keeping on with that sense of reflexivity, and always sort of thinking back about how your personal history might be shaping how you're feeling in your research, how you're interpreting your participants' experiences and the decision-making process through the research as well.
Okay. I mean, I was going to ask you a little bit more about that sort of what, and kind of drawing, I guess, on the masterclass that the very exciting, very good masterclass that you did earlier today, when you kind of engaged with more creative methods as well. So you've talked about the sort of importance of taking a research diary, writing down thoughts, field notes about experiences. I wonder if there are other methods that we should be engaging with, considering to kind of engage with this topic more.
Yeah, so in the workshop I just ran for Methods at Manchester, I created a creative interactive task where participants were tasked with creating a collage or an artistic collage. It could have been on paper. I brought lots of magazines with me and sort of traditional sort of glue and scissors and these sorts of things, or they could create a digital version of that. And I think that really helped to sort of, instead of asking directly, how do you feel vulnerable? What are your experiences? I think that enabled them, almost like a projective technique, to sort of really sort of express their vulnerabilities in nuanced and complex ways, but through a more fun and creative artistic activity. So I think that collage making technique sort of worked quite well in the particular workshop. So perhaps that more artistic route or non-representational route is something where we can sort of be more reflective without having to keep a diary. I know not everybody feels comfortable keeping a diary. I know myself, I've not really kept up that practice as much as I should have since my PhD, because I feel like I don't really have time to write my journal articles, never mind another additional writing tasks. So I think that's where these more creative artistic methods might be quite useful as an alternative way of expressing and thinking through your research of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who participated in that as well, I almost sort of thought one of the things that came out of our group when we were working together is almost this sort of idea of the permission to feel vulnerable. And I think the sort of more playful element of that task almost gave us that permission as well, because it was something that was maybe out of our comfort zone. So doing something different and engaging with something different felt quite good, really.
Glad that you enjoyed it.
I wonder what your sort of takeaways from, obviously you sort of had a range of people who were sort of working in very different research topics, using different methods, and they sort of talked quite openly about their vulnerabilities. I wonder what your sort of takeaways from that, whether there was anything surprising or whether it sort of emphasised things that you were already aware of or something.
Yeah, so I just want to say the group we had were brilliant. They were sort of really open. They hadn't met each other before. I think none of them had really met each other before. So it was really great to see they did feel comfortable enough to share their own experiences. And it was sort of, there was nothing really surprising, but I think it really emphasised that point that no matter what topic you're working on or what field you're from, I think everybody in the room was using qualitative research methods. So it would be sort of quite interesting to do it with a more quantitative focus group of researchers to see if there were any differences. But I think it really emphasised the points of serendipity and sort of unexpected vulnerabilities arising. I think that was a common theme coming across what the workshop participants were expressing, or sort of the stories they were sharing, the fact that sometimes they were looking at a certain topic that wasn't inherently vulnerable. I know with my PhD there was an aspect around memorialisation, death, so I probably thought at some point I might feel a bit upset, but some of the workshop participants today weren't necessarily looking at an inherently vulnerable topic like that. So they had quite unexpected moments of vulnerability arising, and I think that was quite a common theme cutting across the workshop participants that also linked to my personal experiences as well. Another strong thing was that memory idea again as well, about how you can become quite reflective during your study, and there can be sort of very strong links between your personal experiences and your research participants' experiences and so on. So I think those ideas of memory and anticipation and the unexpected nature of research and vulnerabilities were two strong themes that are really emphasised from the workshop participants' sort of contributions today.
I mean, one of the things we talked about as well was the sort of idea that when we're starting a research study, there's a lot of focus on research participants, and particularly that idea of vulnerability and tick, if the participant's going to be sort of vulnerable or not. But we sort of engaged with that sort of idea. It's very, I mean, it goes back to your idea of anticipated, but often we don't anticipate when we're going to be feeling vulnerable. So we put a lot of emphasis on participants. I'm sort of wondering, it sort of moves me on to sort of thinking about practicalities and, what do we do with this knowledge within our institutions, perhaps within supervision teams, outside of academia? Other sort of things you would like to see change or develop?
Yeah, so I think you were saying before about sort of how we often focus on our research participants' vulnerabilities, which is often obviously very important in itself, but as you said, that's quite early on in the project. But I think this idea of vulnerability being this extended thing, it extends before fieldwork, it happens during fieldwork, it can sort of echo back as we're analysing data, or even beyond sort of our project itself as we begin writing up our work and sort of going back to data analysis, trying to go through reviewer processes and so on. So I think it's really important to have that sort of social support in place, both shortly before starting a project, but something that spans throughout the course of the project as well. So we spoke a bit about practical ideas during the workshop itself, and I think one thing that came out was this idea that it could be useful at sort of in doctoral training schemes, or sort of the training that doctoral students might have beforehand, is sort of embedding these sort of sessions in vulnerability in there, so they are perhaps a bit more prepared for research of vulnerability, but also then spanning that support throughout the study. So you might have a particularly supportive supervisor, which I did. I was very lucky with my supervisory team in my case, but I guess not everybody does have a supervisor who they would feel comfortable opening about emotional sides of things with. So I think having some sort of mentorship in place would be really useful, sort of peer support opportunities, perhaps events that go on where people are more vulnerable or open about their vulnerabilities to normalise this. And so it's not this hidden, taboo, sort of secretive thing where people were more frequently openly sharing their vulnerabilities. I've heard, I can't remember the institution, but there's a couple of cases I've seen going around on Twitter where academics in the department sort of showcase their journal rejections or their sort of research failures. Not that anything is a failure, but that's how they would sort of frame it. And I think those sorts of events could be really useful in sort of normalising that, we are all vulnerable as human beings. This isn't this hidden thing that might only happen to a few people, but somewhere along the way in our research journeys, we're probably all going to feel a bit vulnerable at some stages. So any events or mentorship that happens that sort of normalises the sharing and being open about vulnerabilities, I think would be a positive step forward.
That's really interesting. I mean, a lot of this is how much this goes against the grain of what we are taught. We're taught to sort of be perfect, professional, kinds of present things in a very sort of ordered, logical way. And really what you're saying is make space for our vulnerabilities so that they're not positioned as failures, I guess. It's absolutely fascinating. Okay, so we've talked at length about both your experiences of vulnerability, also sort of drawing on others' experiences through the masterclass, and some sort of idea of practical ways in which I guess we can sort of help people become more in touch with and recognise their vulnerabilities and almost put them to sort of positive use rather than being seen as failure, I guess. It's been a really, really fascinating conversation, Chloe. Thank you. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with?
I think all in all, it's about sort of helping people to feel less alone with their vulnerabilities, recognising we're all humans. We're all going to feel a bit vulnerable at some stages in our life, whether it's in academia or outside of academia. It's about sort of embracing and sort of being open to normalising, sharing vulnerabilities rather than trying to erase them or hide them altogether, I think.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Chloe Steadman.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.